Hello and welcome back to IBTM TV. If you've just tuned in, I'm Andy Osho, your host for part one. Thanks for all your interactions so far. Keep them coming. If you want to join the conversation, use hashtag IBTMWorld on socials or the chat box to the right of your screen. And while we're doing mentions, a big shout out to our IBTM TV sponsors, Meet England and Monaco Convention Bureau. If you haven't already, make sure you check out their virtual booth and maybe have a walk-up meeting. So with all that's happened 2021 has not been an easy one to predict. Staying with the theme Build Back Better, the 2021 IBTM Global Trends Report, narrated by Al Turner from 8PR and Marketing, seeks to fully understand the devastation COVID-19 has had on the industry and what 2021 will look like. So it's over to you, Al.
Thank you, Andy. Appreciate that. Yeah, so this is the IBTM World Trends Report. My name's Alistair Turner, and I have the great pleasure and honour of both writing the report and also presenting it to you today. But I wanted to start just by talking briefly about why I feel this report matters so much. There are many reports that look at the meetings and events industry, but for me, this is one of the reports that acknowledges not just what's going on in our industry, but the world around it, the industries that we are reliant on for our businesses, but also the geographic trends that take place around the world and that differentiate this great industry from territory to territory. I should also say that whatever happens, there have been years before where the report's been very, very positive. There's years before where it's been very negative. But we have great support from the guys at IBTM. They never ask us to sugarcoat things. They always ask for empirical data from this. And while we try and present a positive view whenever we can, we're not asked to cover things up or do anything like that. So while this report at times does make for pretty grim reading, it's an honest report, it's a fair report, and it's one that does look to the future with a degree of positivity as well. You can download it. This is just a small snapshot what I'm going to talk to you today. There's so much that I won't cover, things like regions, some of the industries that we look at as well. So please do download it or be live as soon as this session is complete. There's over 60 sources included in there, lots of empirical evidence, lots of opinion from across the industry and outside of it as well. So please do, if you get a chance, have a look through it. We're really proud of it over here. So I just wanted to start by going back to where we were, kind of back in IBTM in Barcelona in November 2019. And I finished my presentation that day with this slide, which is a shot of Ian Malcolm, or Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park. Ian Malcolm plays a chaos theory mathematician. And what chaos theory is all about is that one is always at the edge of chaos. So when things are going very, very well, potentially you're at the chance where things could go badly. If things are going really, really badly, you're often at the chance where things could go well. The dawn is always darkest before the dawn. And what I should say is that although we could never predict what has been a truly catastrophic year for many in the meetings and events industry, what we must say is there were certain warning signs out there. Certainly people like MPI and the incentive meetings industry were looking at things like pandemics, global security as big threats. We had seen SARS and certain things going on in the Asia-Pacific region for some time. And there was a degree of concern as we entered 2020. Certainly economists had their own causes for concern. We saw a cyclical slowdown of the industry as well, what was called a globalization, and also what we saw as the great stall of China as well. So there was always a chance that things weren't going to go well in 2020. However, what we could never have predicted is exactly what happened. I call the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, almost like the industry's kryptonite. We would never have predicted just how hard this has hurt us across so many different industries and so many different subject matters as well. It's been truly devastated. So I guess what we're looking to answer today, and through the report over 65 pages, 20,000 words and 61 sources, is how do we get here and what do we do now? And that's what I'm going to try and sort of cover over the next 30 minutes or so. So let's start a little bit about understanding the world as it stands at the moment. In general, what we've seen is a huge economic hit. Global GDP growth, which was predicted to be around 2.3%, saw an over 5% swing downwards to 2.5%. That's deeper than the global economic crash. So a hugely devastating crisis. But we've also seen it affect both supply and demand. Demand for things like quarantine measures, illnesses, negative consumer and business sentiment has suppressed that demand, whereas the supply was the closure of factories, disruptions to supply chains, freezing of many industries, and the lack of travel on both a local and global nature both hit that supply versus demand train. That's something that's really, really difficult to get back, and that's typified where we are as an industry. Now, one of the things that we've been discussing certainly this morning with Karen from the Asia Pacific region was what we call the bounce back. So actually, as we look into 2021, many regions, many economies are expected to be bouncing back. And I think one of the things that will really interest our industry is how big that bounce is and how that bounce will be characterized and the nature of that bounce. I think one of the things we should also understand here is that these macro changes, these big changes in economic behavior, the effect of the coronavirus has actually gone a long way to exacerbate existing issues as well. Now, we're not going to say for a second that the coronavirus has been influential in causing some of the many fires that have been in the Amazon rainforests, the Australian outback, California, but they have not helped in the solving of it. I'd love it if the coronavirus had done something positive towards the Brexit situation in Europe, but it has exacerbated some of those political divides. Certainly when we look at the relationship between China and America, it's very much been politicized by things like coronavirus. Things also have been happening around Venezuela. If we remember at the beginning of the year in Hong Kong, there was a huge amount of disruption and civil disruption. And who could ignore the huge Black Lives Matter movement? And I think if there was one image that would typify for me 2021 is the Black Lives Matter demonstrations wearing the mask coronavirus. But what we have to understand here is that these global trends hit on a micro level as well. And we're going to talk a little about, in the report, about things like wellness, the loneliness epidemic, and things like that hit on a very, very basic level, a very, very small level. But they do affect how we have our meetings and events. So how did the coronavirus specifically hit us? And I've tried to sort of move this into around sort of 5 different areas. I think, first of all, it's about business success and consumer confidence. If businesses are successful and they're feeling confident, they invest in meetings and events. When businesses are innovating and acting in dynamic ways, they invest in meetings and events. Equally, on the supply side, we need consumers to be willing to come out of their houses and go out there and meet people and want to come and meet people. And both of those areas have been hit by coronavirus. Equally, what we've seen is the travel, the lockdown, and the cancellation that's been going along across lots of our meetings. And what I sort of saw here is this idea of a slow bleed from the industry. It wasn't a definitive cut. It just slowly bled over time. And I think that's been really, really damaging to us. Now, there were some major companies like Facebook and Microsoft who actually decided to cancel their meetings pretty much from around March time until the new year, until 2021. And at the time, many of us in the industry were quite surprised by the deep cut that was indicating. It seems that they were probably right to do so. Many of us carried on, though, and it was that slow cut, that slow bleed that typified that. Then we look at something like social distancing as well. And what's that? It's about margin. It's about the fact that we're holding events where we're not able to put as many people in the room and give as many people the same experience. And it's changed the nature, both in terms of the value and the quality of the event, but also the way that people make money through the events industry. And that's been really, really difficult. What has come into place is obviously the emergence of even more digital and virtual events. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as well. But then we look at things like margins and business sustainability. All of that has sort of changed. The idea that as we reduce numbers, as we move the nature of our events, it will affect the way the supply chain deals with event organisers, and a big part of that is risk. The idea is that we need to have new conversations around risk. Who's going to take on the risk for the events? Is it the venues? Is it the event organisers? Is it our corporate paymasters as well? And who's going to take on the risk for the individual as well, as we ask them to go into potentially higher risk zones in a new era of coronavirus? I wanted to look at a number of mega trends. Now, I call these trends, but we need to see these trends as more than just small trends. Essentially what they are is huge macro trends that are affecting mass consumer behavior around the world. They've become ubiquitous in society. But I think if we are able to look at both our past and our future through the prism of these trends, we'll find out more about what our future could look like. And those trends are diversity, wellness, security, and technology, and the virtual experience economy. Now, what I've asked to do is brought in a few experts who are going to talk a little bit about some of these trends, just to give you some outside opinion as well. And we're going to start by looking at sustainability. Now, this is a massive trend for 2021, and I think most people are aware about how big this could be. But I think we really need to understand that this isn't just a continuation of a trend from 2020. This is a whole new thing that we're going to be looking at. It's going to go so big that I think many of us will look back and be surprised about how big this was. It's changing the way elections are being fought. It's changing the way businesses are acting towards their consumers. Consumers holding them accountable, citizens holding governments accountable. But within the industry, we talked to a lady called Fiona Pelham, who runs Positive Impact Events. And I asked Fiona what she felt this was with regards to skills and how the industry should approach sustainability from a skills perspective.
That is an excellent question. So where the sector was with sustainability was focused more on an environmental approach. And what I would explain as event sector creating things for the event sector, which is great because it moves sustainability forward, but there is a gap. And I want to share 4 strategic actions that I can see that can close this gap so that the event sector can be recognized for the sustainable sector that it is. The first action, and these actions are not tiny practical actions, they're very high level strategic. The first action is to change the narrative that our event sector has. So create a narrative that is in line with what businesses and governments are all working towards, and that is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal Framework. There is a goal SDG 16, and a target around participation and inclusion in decision making. And if any sector does anything clearly, it is the event sector enabling participation in decision making. So building our narrative around that sustainable development goal would have us be able to talk at a high level strategic and government and business level. The second action is to continue to build capacity within the sector. This year, Positive Impact has upskilled over 1,200 event professionals with the support of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the UK that has enabled resources to be created around the international standard ISO 20121 and UNICEF UK, who have created guidelines for the consideration of human and child rights when planning an event. The third step I would recommend is to increase our focus on innovation. And we've done a few experiments with corporate event planners, and there is a huge gap in potential here. And then finally, the fourth action for us to take, I'm going to paint the picture of the COP26 climate change and the UK Prime Minister standing up as he hosts the most important event in our lifetime and potentially our Earth's history, and explains how the event sector built back better from being hit and destroyed by COVID-19 to building back in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, in line with international standards like ISO 20121, and being able to export that expertise and demonstrate that the event sector is an incredibly valuable sector, much needed in building back better and building the future of what our world and society looks like.
That's great. Thank you, Fiona, for your thoughts on that, and what a great vision that is to look at November later next year as a great start from happens to be a major event in our industry taking place then as well. Security would be the second trend, and I won't go into too much detail around this, just purely because we're living with the effects of security right now. But we should remember that security isn't just about things like pandemics. We should remember, though, that this photograph in the slide was taken in 2003. We are living in the age of pandemics. What was a shock to many in the Western world won't be as big as a shock in the future, as we've seen on our Asia-Pacific region. But let's not also forget about some of the other security things that are going on at the moment. Yes, we still continue to live in a slightly unstable world. There are political instabilities. There is risk to personal safety. And we have to consider that against things like environmental security risks as well. There's data risks, which is a massive, massive one. We're going to talk a little bit about this emergence of AI as a continuing macro effect on how we do business and where we do business. Events industry people hold a lot of data, and there's a huge risk in there about how we deal with that as well. So we need to look at risks in all its forms and safety and security in all its forms as we go forward into 2021 as well. It would be wrong not to address diversity and inclusion. Within the industry, within the report, we look at diversity and inclusion as very much around the Black Lives Matter movement and what's been going on globally there. However, I do think it would be best to get a different opinion on this, and we're very, very lucky. I got some time to speak to Ashanti from Diversity Ally, one of the best movers in the industry around this subject, and I spoke to Ashanti about what her views were on diversity as we go forward into 2021.
Most companies in the events industry globally are struggling to ensure that their culture, image, and people reflect the world that we currently live in. It's not easy, and what we've seen is that less than half of websites that are obviously owned by events companies even have a diversity and inclusion policy that is accessible and viewable by not only their employees, but also potential clients. Studies and research that have happened in 2020, many of which have been collated and conducted by main big publishers in the events industry, have really shown the same results. There is a problem when it comes to diversity and inclusion in the events industry, which is a bit of a shame because a brilliant industry which touches multiple industries could really model true diversity and inclusion. And when we talk about that, we're not only talking about race or gender, we're also talking about the inclusion of disabled persons, for example, even how inclusive our technology and digital is in the events industry. So what can be done at the moment? Well, there's three key areas that Diversity Ally has brought to the event industry's attention. It is culture, image, and people. Right now, Generation Z and millennials, their world has changed. And their expectations of the brands that they work with, they work for, and they promote are high. Okay, diversity and inclusion across all of the strands are really important to them. So if you're an events company who's looking at how you can keep your community connected, but also attract that next wave of buying power, of consumer, then it's really important now that you start thinking about diversity and inclusion. And not only when it comes to the makeup of your speaker panels, or indeed the imagery that you use in your marketing and social media, but more importantly, who are you hiring? Are they being paid fairly and equally as their counterparts? What is the talent development strategy that you have internally? What are the pathways to success and promotion within your company? What kind of suppliers and partners do you have? Do you even have an expectation that your partners and suppliers are also trying to be as diverse and inclusive as possible? So have a look at culture, image, and people in 2021 if you want to see an upward trend in diversity and inclusion within your company.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Ashanti, for bringing that to us. What a great insight to what we need to be looking at as an industry, as a society in 2021. I want to use wellness as a way of bridging what we've talked about in terms of sustainability, Ashanti's words around diversity and inclusion, and to link that together with hybrid events and the future of technology and the virtual experience economy just now, because wellness is changed in its tone throughout 2020. And it's about this thing around societal review, how we look at ourselves as a society, how we look at our relationship with each other and with the planet as well. And what we're going to see is something that's coming up quite a few times already in this conference, is this idea of purpose really being elevated to something that encapsulates events as something that has to have a different level of value when we go to them. And we have to understand that people are entering our events in a very, very different way. They need to see a different level of value, but they need to see a different level of purpose from the event organizers and the businesses that are presenting them in front of them as well. I should also add that there will be a high degree of personalization around well-being. Sometimes well-being is typified as something that's en masse, but actually we're going to see more trends that are about looking at the individual as part of well-being, and this idea of deep personalization, which we cover more in the report as well. And lastly, the virtual experience economy and how that's going to work in 2021. Now, I won't talk too much about how this will look. I'll let Kim Meyer from Experience Design to do the talking for me, who looks directly at that point, this idea of technology, sustainability, and purpose all merging together.
Well, I mean, I think the really important driving force behind the growth of the virtual economy has been the sort of technology revolution that we've seen come on. I mean, we're more technology empowered than we've ever been. We don't have to go to events to network. We don't have to go to events to learn things. We don't have to go to events to entertain ourselves. We have, those tools available to us online. And I think post-COVID, in particular, we've really gotten used to using these technologies in more meaningful ways, and they've improved. And on top of that, we've recognized that there are some real advantages to using virtual and online tools for people to come together. We can reach more people more efficiently and more effectively, particularly people who may have been disfranchised and not able to attend events, now can have access to that content and to those experiences. We know that it's more environmentally sustainable. It's cut down on air travel and lots of energy and carbon footprint. So, there are advantages there. In addition, in these days where brands really need to demonstrate social purpose, the ability to build continuous online communities around key issues is really powerful. I mean, I think event organizers were really just getting their heads around how to create socially purposeful and meaningful experiences within their events. But many of them, post-event sort of lost that momentum. I think with the new kinds of tools we're seeing in the virtual economy, we're going to really be able to engage many more people more frequently and on a more continuous basis. So yes, whilst, we're still going to want to, as people meet, I think we really need to look at how our whole environment has been transformed by these new technologies and given a real accelerator by the trauma that we've experienced in 2020.
Again, brilliant thoughts and brilliant words from a great professional. Kim, thank you so much for that. I really, really appreciate it. And I think where that lands, certainly what the evidence in the report comes out with is a phrase that another good colleague of mine talks about, was this idea of digital twinning, where one could create two events, one purely digital and one purely live. And it's the merging of those two events at any one point that will typify what events in 2021 looks like. It's the idea that risk can be managed by being able to pivot between the two. Now, what does that mean for an event organizing company? Well, one of the things that we've seen really for the last 10 years, but we'll see really develop over the next 10 years, is that our event organizing companies are going to start looking more and more like media companies. There's going to be more hiring of production, direction, acting staff coming onto those books than there used to be. So the idea is that an event company will look as much like an event company as it will look like a media company. And if you want a really good example of that, again, a good friend of mine also spoke to me about what could be going on versus on the stage versus off the stage. And he said that he's as much likely in 2021 to hiring a big name drawer for $100,000 to stand at the front of the stage and drag people into that event as he is to put £100,000 worth of directorial talent behind the stage of an event. So who knows, the next major event could be directed by Steven Spielberg. You never know. And I think what that shows is exactly where the future of the events industry is looking like. And with that layer of purpose and social responsibility coming into it, I think it could be a really incredible way of seeing events in the future. I wanted to touch on some of the corporate industries that affect our industry. Now, we look at quite a few in the trends report, but I'm only going to touch on a couple now because I think what they do is they tell us a story about our events industry and where its value should learn. Now, it would be wrong for me not to address pharma. It's one of the industries that our industry relies on so heavily. There's a wonderful partnership between medical conventions and congresses and the events industry. This is an industry that is changing so dynamically at the moment. Not only is it continuing to grow exponentially as an industry, so it's doing well, it's showing its value to the rest of society by things like the COVID vaccine. It's actually been freed up hugely as well as an industry. One of its big complaints in previous years is that it is so wrapped up in red tape. Well, actually, because of things like the vaccine, a lot of that red tape is starting to be taken away. Now, why should we care about all of those things in the events industry? Not just because it allows our delegates to freely walk into our meetings, hopefully in 2021. Well, actually, what we like as an events industry is we like industries that are doing well, we like businesses that are showing innovation, and we like anything that feeds the knowledge economy. So dynamism within an industry really, really helps us. So the fact that the pharma industry, one of our favorites, is growing and showing itself as dynamic is really great news for the events industry. So something to be feeling really positive about. On a slightly different level, we've got the tech industry, which again is an industry that has both a good side and a bad side, of which we can profit from both. Now, over the course of the next 5 years, the report showed that the majority of the growth for the events industry will be around sort of 4 areas, which is cloud, mobile, social, and big data and analytics. That will reach around 600 trillion worth of industry by 2023. So what we have is a huge amount of growth and a huge amount of dynamism. However, anyone that flicked on the news this morning and saw the US courts talking to Facebook will know that this is an industry that has a huge amount of controversy as well. We've seen ByteDance and TikTok facing US sanctions and action. We've seen the Huawei deliverable of 5G facing controversy, certainly in Europe and North America. And these things have caused a huge amount of disruption within the industry, but also on a global nature, heavily politicized activity. Also, again, within countries, within destinations, we've seen tech companies getting so big. So the Apple capitalization of $2 trillion earlier this year, and obviously what's happening with Facebook shows that this is an industry that's getting too big for its own good. And actually what that is doing is that's feeding, again, more conversations, more regulations, and that feeds the knowledge economy. So again, we should be excited about working with this industry. This is an industry who historically have a great relationship with meetings and events. They like the fact that whereas they live in a very digital space, we live in a very tangible live space. So the relationship is really, really strong. But also this idea of feeding the knowledge economy is a great way for us to activate within this specific industry. So we should feel good about this industry. The report looks at other industries as well. I would highly recommend the area on esports if you're looking at events that are targeting younger people and are pivoting from instead of from live to digital, but from digital to live. We also look at other industries as well around banking and finance as well. So it's well worth having a look at, hopefully, as well. So how about the corporate trends? So we're going to look now at the corporate industry. We're going to look at the association industry, and we're going to look at incentive travel. Just in terms of corporates, as well as what I've just talked about in terms of those industries, I think the main thing is that it's optimism from the event planners, but fear remains the biggest obstacle. And that is pervasive throughout the events industry. And it's something that we're going to have to tangle with, certainly in the first quarter to first half of the year, depending on where you are geographically. The reality is many corporate event planners have not had a low period throughout 2020. They've still had to deliver events. It's how they've had to deliver events that has been the issue. But what has been the opportunity is that their events have been uncancelable. These events are not ones that one can just throw away. They've had to happen. And because of that, they've proved their worth within their business. And that's a great platform for them to be taking through into 2021. The problem is, it's the fear of the delegate. Now, again, within the report, we look at some of that consumer data, and it's my opinion that consumers will come back to events quicker than perhaps we think, especially when they see great examples through major sporting events. And again, Karen spoke about the Boxing Day cricket fixture in Sydney earlier this morning, and how events like that will see people get group confidence. So I don't think it's far away. We then look at the association meeting sector as well. And I think what the association meeting sector shows us is where our business could be coming from in the future. And I think what they talked about very, very early on over the last sort of 4 to 5 years is this STEM. Medical science now quotes for about 17% of all association meetings, technology 15%, science 13%. We see that actually these are the industries that are driving us forward. And we should be excited about those industries as they return to popularity. And we should be targeting them for association business. Association meetings are a great barometer of where we are as an industry. There's also the ICA rankings, which are a great way of understanding where the industry is at the moment. And we see in terms of the country rankings, the US continue to dominate, ahead of Germany, France, Spain, and the UK. Whereas Europe dominates on a city rankings, with Paris leading Lisbon, Berlin, Barcelona, and Madrid. I should also point out as well the Middle East. I think where we see globally, we see Europe and North America as very, very trusted, experienced industries. We see Asia Pacific as a real growth area. But Middle East is a great value area, about 11 billion being spent in that territory. So one to watch there as well. And then we have the incentive travel industry, which is an interesting one on two sides. There's one side which this is the industry that probably hit harder than any other sector within our industry, because it's so much about that transatlantic, those cross-border travel, and they've been hit really, really hard. Spending has been down. The predictions aren't for full recovery until around 2022, 23 at the earliest. So there's some downbeat people. What is interesting, though, is the dynamics of that industry, that sector has changed. So what people are now looking at is travel on their doorstep. And it's amazing, certainly as someone who lives and works in the UK, seeing the amount of incentive agencies who have been traveling around the world for their incentive trips and have realized that actually about 10 miles down the road, there's these amazing destinations. And although we'd like to see more transformative travel and finding new things and exploring and exciting people culturally, that's great. But actually, isn't it nice that the sector has been able to pivot to local as well? So lastly, just to look at around 2021 and beyond, I think a lot about the young people, younger generation, and how they view our industry and what effect are they going to have on the industry. And it's worth noting that the average age of a person on planet Earth right now is 35. And it's worth noting that that number is going down. In Africa, it's 19, with many more people about to enter the workforce of that centennial age. And I think what that's doing is it's changing the demands of the delegate to the event organizer. It's changing the attitude of the organizer, how they want to put their event together. It's changing the values of the business and its staff. And the idea is what we're now seeing is this new generation bringing new values into the industry. Millennials, who we talked about for the last sort of 3 or 4 years, they're no longer junior positions anymore. They're actually in senior management positions. They are now making decisions. So how do we address that? How do we talk to them? And again, everything that we're talking about within the report talks around consistent areas, which is we create content with strategic thinking and creative execution. We make events worth their time. We create experiences that are self-curated by them. For so long, bad events have been typified by the fact that they just give information out instead of allowing people to come in and create their own experiences and to make choices on what they want to see and what they don't want to see. This is a generation that, again, is typified by their love of choosing and having choice. We personalize their experiences so they feel human and with purpose and with societal aims in it as well. We've got to remember that those mega trends are coming forth through this generation, and they want to personalize that. But we also want them to connect with events in a different way and connect with each other in a different way whilst being at events. And finally, to connect with the world in a different way. One of the things that it's worth looking at outside of how young people do this, approach events, is about how we as an industry work together as well. And a big part of that is around risk. Now, because we're now living in such interesting times around pandemics and security risks, one of the big things that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to start looking at the risks that we pass on to the delegates. We can no longer guarantee their safety all the time. So we need to have a conversation about delegate risk and passing that on. But we also need to have a conversation amongst ourselves about risk as well and who takes that on. And for me, that isn't about writing new lines in contracts, pandemic insurance and things like that. It's about total flexibility within the industry about how we go about booking our meetings. Now, the industry, one of its great points is how collaborative it is and how good it is about having conversations with itself. And those conversations will be really, really important as we get together in 2021, because these events are not as stable as they were in 2020. And we're going to have to find new ways of making sure that they can happen flexibly and that we manage the risk on how we do things. I'm excited about 2021. I think it could be a fantastic year for the industry. I think it's going to be a really tough year for the industry. We are slowly getting back on our feet, but we should be confident that there is a bounce ahead of us. Economic recovery will happen across the globe. Businesses will become more confident. Consumers will become more confident. And just like I ended last year with that we were at the edge of chaos in a negative way, perhaps that chaos theory will return in a more positive way as we look forward to 2021. I'd encourage you to read the IBTM World Trends Report for more detail on all of those sort of things. But for now, I thank you for your time.
Fantastic. Thank you, Al, for breaking down all that information. What I'm beginning to realize is how many contributing factors there are to your industry. So Al's going to actually answer some questions. So if you haven't sent through a question yet, please do put your questions into the chat box, which is on the right-hand side of your screen, or you can join in the conversation using the hashtag that I mentioned earlier. Al, hi.
Hiya.
It's a speedy whip around the studio there.
Right.
I appreciate you. So we've got a question come in. It says, I know you didn't have a chance to talk about some of the geographical trends in the report today. So maybe you can talk about some of the rising stars, the winners, the losers in 2020.
Yeah, I think there's a number of things to say around that. First of all, for the last 10, 15 years, a lot of economists have been looking at this move from an Atlantic economy to a Pacific economy. And what we've seen, and anyone who saw Karen's session this morning will see that if there was a winner economically, and I know it sounds horrible to say that around something so devastating as coronavirus, it is the Asia-Pacific region. Mm-hmm. They've been able to get themselves back on their feet. We've got China is one of the few countries on the planet that's actually shown growth in 2020. We've got places like South Korea. Taiwan has no infection rates whatsoever. Brand Australia and brand New Zealand have grown massively. And what they're seeing is that growth has meant that they're bouncing back sooner, they're getting recovery quicker, and from an events perspective, they've shown themselves to be well managed from a brand perspective in that light. So actually Asia Pacific is a really, really good one. I get really excited around Africa because there's just so many great things being opened up. Africa's actually had a horrible 2020 as a region. It's devastated many parts. But actually, again, as the bounce back comes through, more infrastructure is being put in place. What we call in the report was this idea of intelligent infrastructure that can actually help meetings and events happen through destination management, airline management, and things like that. So we're excited there. And the value proposition, lastly, of the Middle East as well. And I said on the slide around the association meetings, the value of the meetings being held in the Middle East is something we should all be really excited about. It's a high value part of the world. It's a high value sort of meetings. And there's great stuff going out there. So they would be the areas that I'd typify for ones to watch in 2021.
So those are the winners. Can say anything about the losers? Because that's what this question also mentions as well. Or is that a bit more harder to say?
It is hard to say. I mean, look, we all lost, didn't we? You know, it's been a brutal year for everyone. And I think the people that the territories that have lost have been the ones that just weren't set up to cope with things. And actually the events industry is within those territories that weren't able to pivot. So, I could argue that sitting here where we are just outside London in the UK, we haven't had a great coronavirus. However, what I do see is a number of our event organising companies that have pivoted magnificently and have actually created hybrid divisions, hybrid businesses within weeks, and are now leading the world in terms of what they're doing in terms of hybrid events. So there are losing areas, but hopefully they've pivoted as well.
And it seems like a country's ability to contain the virus definitely impacts on their ability to recover.
Absolutely, yeah. And we're an industry that perhaps relies too much on that. And I think if we're gonna be honest with ourselves, we relied too much on that in 2020 because we did get crippled in ways that we just weren't ready for. So actually, going forward in 2021, we need to try and be more self-reliant. Now, that's a big thing to do. That's a really hard thing to do, and it's not something that can be done overnight. But again, if we look at those winners, though, those industries that have very, very close relationships with government, who understand where their value is, that can protect them if they need to, allow them to protect themselves if possible as well. And I think that way, as we go forward, and yes, we will be reliant on travel bans and air bridges and all those sort of things that will help us get back on our feet. Hopefully, we're not too reliant on those as an industry.
Okay. So we have another question. You talked about young people. Why is this something that this report is more interested in for 2021 as opposed to other years?
I think I don't know about you, but sometimes when we are in coffee shops or I'm talking to my friends, we talk about millennials, there's snowflakes and things like that. And we have this sort of slight flippant view of younger people coming through. But as I get older, I realise that younger people aren't younger anymore. And we have to understand that these values that were millennial are extremely important from a centennial generation, and those people are coming into our events, and they're coming into our events in their droves, and they're bringing with us those values. And I keep thinking about what's happening as 2020 as this reset moment where, back in the day you could turn your computer on and turn it back on again and everything sort of starts afresh. If we present, for me, a 2017, 2019 event industry to that generation, I don't think it's going to fly. I think over the last 9 months, if there's one thing that's typified global societies, it's how much reflection that they've had. And if you take those younger generations, it's the amount of reflection that they're having, and they're looking at us older folk, and they're looking at us and they're saying, actually, what are the values of what you're asking me to do? What is my business's values? What is the values of the brands I'm buying into? Why should I get on a plane that's chewing out CO2 and go to an event where people are drinking champagne in expensive hotels? What's in it for me? What's in it for my soul? What's in it for the globe around me? And if we can't answer those questions, then actually we're missing this increasingly large part of our delegations. And those 5 trends that we talk about in the report are all incredibly important to that younger generation. So today, right now, as we present the report, it's more important than it's ever been. And I think if you miss it, by next year it would have gone. If you haven't got it this year,
sure,
next year it would have gone.
So they're a really important group to keep an eye on and you know, address their issues and what's important to them.
Yeah, they behave. Sorry, it sounds all young people are the same, but we have to understand that digital natives, young people being educated in different ways, walk into events in a different way. They see the sets in a different way. They see their arrival in a different way. They want to connect in different ways. Linear events are no good to them. We can't serve them up what they want. They like to choose and how they go about their business. So we need to keep an eye on their changing way of doing things. And that'll be centennials, it'll be the generation afterwards, it'll be the generation afterwards. And what that means is our ability to predict the future will change because it's always changing, because the generations are always changing. Their learning mileage is getting smaller and smaller every single day. I think that the way they consume information is smaller and smaller every day. So we just need to be on top of it all the time.
Wow, so that's the group to watch out for. So thank you, Al, for answering those questions. I wish we had time for more. This is so fascinating. You fielded all those questions, and kudos to all of you guys for in the industry, because you've been so resilient this year. So here's to a brighter, better events world in 2021. We're going to take another quick break, but coming up is our keynote with Philip Legrain, a political economist who will talk about the prospects and opportunities for the industry in 2021. So more looking into people's crystal balls there. But before that, we'll hear about those who've been hardest hit in this sector, venues. We'll see you shortly.